There's a kind of strength in a meal that can be made with almost nothing. A few potatoes, a scrap of meat, some bacon grease. These were the meals that didn't just fill stomachs, they filled gaps in the day and reminded tired men they still had a place at the table. Tuna noodle ring mold. It looked like something out of a 1950s cookbook, and maybe it was. But for families scraping by, the tuna noodle ring mold wasn't about presentation. It was about pride. You started with egg noodles, boiled just until tender, then folded them into a creamy, salty mixture of canned tuna, peas, mayonnaise, or cream of mushroom soup, and a heavy dash of black pepper. Some folks added a sprinkle of paprika on top if they were feeling fancy, but most didn't bother. The real magic happened when the mixture got packed into a heavy ring mold, greased and waiting like an empty stage. It baked in the oven until just solid enough to flip without falling apart. When it landed on the plate with a soft, steaming thud, there was no applause, just hungry eyes waiting for a slice. It wasn't pretty, but it tasted like every good memory crammed into a casserole, creamy, salty, soft, and warm. It sliced clean, reheated like a dream, and made sure nobody went to bed hungry. In kitchens, where every meal had to stretch a little further, the tuna noodle ring mold wasn't a joke. It was a quiet little victory. Bubble and squeak, fried leftover potatoes and vegetables. Nothing about it sounded elegant, and that was exactly the point. Bubble and squeak was the kind of dinner built from what nobody else wanted: leftover potatoes, limp cabbage, forgotten carrots. Tossed together in a hot skillet with a little fat, bacon grease if you were lucky, lard if you weren't. They fried until the edges crisped and the middle stayed soft. The name came from the sound it made as it cooked, the bubbling of the fat, the squeak of cabbage pressing against the pan. You didn't need measurements or a recipe. You just needed scraps and a good ear. Some folks added a handful of chopped onions or a slice of leftover meat. But most nights it was just starch and stubbornness fried into something hot and heavy. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't meant to be. It was food that made the most of nothing. Food that filled the house with the smell of frying potatoes and gave tired families something to sit down to. At a time when leftovers weren't just common, they were expected, Bubble and Squeak made sure no bite was wasted and no stomach went empty. Fried bologna and eggs. It wasn't steak and eggs, but on the rough weeks, fried bologna and eggs could make you feel like you were eating something special. Bologna, thick sliced, from the cheapest package you could find, hit the skillet and curled up at the edges almost instantly, the fat sizzling out into the pan. You cracked a couple of eggs right into the grease, letting them fry up with crispy edges and runny yolks if you were lucky enough to catch them just right. The smell of salty meat and eggs filled the whole kitchen, making the walls and your clothes smell like breakfast, no matter what time of day it was. Some folks slapped the bologna and eggs between two slices of white bread and called it a sandwich. Others just forked it straight off the plate with a heavy grind of black pepper on top. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't refined. But fried bologna and eggs was fast, filling, and cost next to nothing, exactly what you needed when money was tight and the day had already worn you thin. Ham hocks and cabbage. You could smell it long before you saw the pot, a smoky, meaty scent that drifted down the block, slipping through windows and pulling you home. Ham hocks and cabbage didn't come from recipe books. They came from knowing how to turn cheap cuts into pure gold. Ham hocks, dirt cheap and loaded with flavor, were thrown into a pot with water and left to simmer low and slow. Cabbage came next, chopped into thick wedges and added just as the meat started to fall apart. The broth turned rich and smoky, the ham tender enough to nudge off the bone with a spoon, and the cabbage soaking up every last drop like it had been waiting for it all its life. Sometimes a few potatoes made it in, sometimes a handful of beans. But even on its own, this dish could stretch for days, ladled out into bowls, dunked with crusty bread, and savored till the last shred was gone. Ham hocks and cabbage didn't pretend to be anything fancy. It was a working man's dinner built on patience, thrift, and a deep understanding that the best meals are the ones you make out of almost nothing. Potato cakes with onion. It started with yesterday's mashed potatoes, the cold, stiff kind that nobody wanted to eat straight from the icebox. You stirred in a handful of chopped onions, maybe an egg if you had one to spare, and enough flour to pull the whole thing together. Then you shaped it rough by hand, no fancy cutters, and dropped the cakes straight onto a hot, greased skillet. The edges crisped and browned almost before you could flip them, the onions sizzling sweet into the batter and sending up a smell that filled every room. You didn't need toppings. You didn't need sides. Just a fork, or your hands if nobody was looking, and a big plate of hot golden potato cakes. Some folks dusted them with a little salt. Some drizzled them with whatever scrap of gravy might be left over from the night before. Most just ate them straight off the pan, burning their fingers because waiting was worse than the burn. Potato cakes with onion weren't about impressing anybody. They were about not wasting a thing and finding a little crisp, golden joy in the middle of a tough week. Chicken livers with rice and peppers. You knew what was cooking the second you walked through the door. It wasn't subtle. Chicken livers pan-fried with diced onions and chopped bell peppers filled the whole house with a smell that hit you like a brick wall. Some folks loved it, some wrinkled their noses, but nobody walked away from a plate still hungry. Livers were cheap, dirt cheap, and packed with iron, protein, and a rich, earthy flavor most people today would barely recognize. Tossed in a hot skillet with just enough oil to sizzle, they browned fast, soaking up every bit of flavor from the onions and peppers. A splash of hot sauce or a pinch of garlic powder took it even further, stretching a few cents worth of ingredients into a meal that could last 2 days. Rice was the great stretcher, piling high on the plate under a ladle of that sizzling liver and pepper mix. It filled your belly and left enough for a quick scoop into a lunch pail the next morning. In kitchens where every dollar mattered, chicken livers weren't a punishment. They were a promise that you could still eat well even when money was tight. Fried rice with scraps of whatever. Fried rice wasn't born in high-end restaurants. It came out of battered kitchens where yesterday's leftovers turned into tonight's salvation. Cold rice, scraped from the bottom of an old pot, went into a screaming hot skillet, slicked with bacon fat, lard, or whatever grease hadn't already been stretched into something else. Then came the scraps, slivers of onion, bits of scrambled egg, a handful of canned peas, a chunk of leftover ham, or sausage if you were lucky. No rules, no recipe, just whatever you could scavenge thrown into the pan and stirred hard and fast. A splash of soy sauce or a pinch of salt was enough to pull it all together, every grain coated in fat and flavor. Sometimes it came out crisp at the edges. Sometimes it was soft and steaming. Either way, it filled the plate, filled the house with the smell of something real, and filled the belly until tomorrow. Fried rice wasn't a plan. It was a rebellion against waste, proof that a little heat and a little hunger could turn scraps into something worth sitting down for. Cabbage and noodles, haluski. It smelled like home before you even stepped through the door. Sweet onions frying low and slow in a big pool of bacon grease or butter, cabbage chopped rough and tossed into the skillet until it wilted down to half its size. Haluski wasn't just food. It was a promise that no matter how thin the pantry was, dinner would still happen. Boiled egg noodles got folded into the mix next, soft and slippery, soaking up every bit of the rich, buttery flavor left in the pan. Salt, pepper, and maybe a little garlic powder if you were lucky. That was all it needed. It didn't look like much. A big steaming heap of pale noodles and wilted cabbage, glistening and heavy. But it filled you up, kept you moving, and made sure no one left the table hungry. Haluski was the food of steel towns and coal camps, immigrant kitchens and farmhouse tables, where stretching a head of cabbage and a bag of noodles into a meal was just another part of surviving the week. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about keeping everyone standing. Chipped beef on toast. SOS. On a shingle. It wasn't polite to say what it really was, but everyone knew the nickname SOS. It stood for on a shingle, and it fed generations of soldiers, factory workers, and hungry kids who needed something fast, salty, and heavy. You started with chipped dried beef, thin slices pulled from a jar or a little vacuum-sealed pouch, tossed into a hot skillet with melted butter. Then you stirred in a spoonful of flour, made a quick roux, and poured in milk until a thick, creamy gravy came together, spotted with bites of salty beef. Meanwhile, you toasted whatever bread you could get your hands on. Cheap white bread was the classic, but anything that could hold gravy would do. The whole sloppy mess was ladled over the toast, soaking into every corner until the bread nearly disappeared under the weight. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't delicate. It was blunt force food, designed to hit the stomach like a brick and hold you there until the next meal. Chipped beef on toast wasn't about flavor fireworks. It was about putting something hot and heavy on the plate when the world didn't give you much else. Canned tamale pie with cornbread crust. It didn't come from a fancy recipe card. It came straight from the pantry, thrown together from whatever cans hadn't been opened yet. Canned tamale pie was the kind of working man's dinner that smelled like it took all day to make, but came together in under an hour. You browned a pound of ground beef, stirred in a can of corn, a can of tomatoes or tomato sauce, and maybe a can of beans if you had one. A heavy shake of chili powder or cumin turned it from scraps into something that smelled like Sunday supper. The real magic was the cornbread, mixed from a box and poured right on top. It baked into a golden, fluffy blanket, while the beefy filling bubbled up around the edges. When it came out of the oven, you didn't wait long, just grabbed a big spoon and dug straight in. Every bite was rich, smoky, and sweet from the corn, packed with enough meat and starch to keep you full till tomorrow. It wasn't about presentation. It was about filling plates without emptying wallets. Canned tamale pie proved you didn't need much to eat like a king, just a can opener and a little imagination. Cornbread and buttermilk, soup. When the cupboard was bare and there wasn't even a pot to boil, cornbread and buttermilk soup came to the rescue. It wasn't really a soup, not in the way you'd think. It was a rough, gritty answer to hunger, built on scraps and handed down like a secret handshake between the hard luck and the hungry. You crumbled leftover cornbread into a chipped bowl, poured cold buttermilk over it until the crumbs floated and softened, and stirred until it looked like something halfway between porridge and stew. Some folks added a pinch of salt, others a sprinkle of black pepper, but most just ate it plain, spoon by spoon, heavy in the mouth and cold against the heat of long summer nights. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't elegant, but it filled your gut without emptying your pockets. And sometimes that was more important than anything else. In the lean years, cornbread and buttermilk soup wasn't a fallback. It was a lifeline built out of nothing but grit and the stubborn refusal to go hungry. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't supposed to be. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes was about getting food on the table fast, hot, and cheap. A skillet full of sizzling ground beef, browned until crumbly, was the foundation. You pushed the meat aside, stirred flour right into the fat, and poured in milk or water, stirring until it thickened into a creamy, salty gravy that smelled like home. Piled high over a mound of mashed potatoes, whether from scratch or straight out of a box, the gravy seeped into every crack and crevice, turning a simple plate into something rich and heavy. Frozen peas might make it onto the side if you had a few extra minutes. Otherwise, it was just meat, potatoes, and the kind of salty, savory bite that made you forget what you didn't have. It wasn't diner food, and it wasn't trying to be. It was Tuesday night food, end of the month food, the food that kept kids fed and parents sane. In homes where the grocery bill decided what kind of week you were going to have. Hamburger gravy was the difference between going without and going to bed full. Macaroni and tomatoes with bacon grease. It was quick, dirty, and tasted like home. Macaroni and tomatoes with bacon grease was the kind of meal you made when payday was still too far away and the fridge was starting to echo. You boiled elbow macaroni just until tender, drained it, and then threw it straight into a hot skillet slicked with leftover bacon grease, if you had any. No bacon? No problem. The grease alone carried the smoky, savory flavor like a secret ingredient passed down in whispers. A can of tomatoes, juice and all, got dumped in next, simmering until the macaroni soaked up every drop. A little salt, a lot of black pepper, maybe a pinch of sugar to cut the acid if you were feeling generous. There were no sides, no fancy toppings, no garnish, just a deep bowl of smoky, tangy pasta that filled you up and didn't ask for much in return. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even particularly pretty, but it was fast, it was cheap, and it made sure there was something hot on the table at the end of a long, empty day. And sometimes that was more than enough. Oatmeal stretched meatloaf. When breadcrumbs ran out, or when every penny counted, oats stepped up. Oatmeal stretched meatloaf wasn't a compromise. It was a survival strategy, one that turned a single pound of ground beef into a meal big enough to feed a small army. You started with raw oats, dumped straight into the meat along with a cracked egg, a splash of milk, and a heavy pinch of salt and pepper. Maybe some chopped onions if you had them. The oats soaked up every drop of fat and flavor, binding the loaf together while adding a chew and heartiness that no breadcrumbs could match. Shaped into a pan, smeared with a thick layer of ketchup, and baked until the top caramelized into a sticky sweet crust, oatmeal meatloaf came out humble but mighty. It sliced thick and held together on the plate, served with canned green beans or mashed potatoes, whatever you had on hand. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. It was dependable. And in a world that gave nothing away for free, oatmeal stretched meatloaf gave you just enough to keep fighting. Egg drop soup with leftover vegetables. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't even much of a meal. But when the cupboard was down to scraps, egg drop soup kept you going. You boiled a pot of thin broth, chicken if you had a leftover carcass, water with a bouillon cube if you didn't. Leftover vegetables got chopped rough and thrown in. Wilted celery, a stray carrot, a handful of peas. Nothing went to waste. When the broth was boiling hard, you cracked an egg into a bowl, whisked it with a fork, and poured it slowly into the pot in a thin stream, stirring gently to create wisps of soft cooked egg floating like torn ribbons in the soup. A little salt, a crack of pepper, maybe a splash of soy sauce if there was some forgotten bottle in the back of the pantry. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot. It was nourishing enough to put something warm in your belly when there wasn't much else coming. Egg drop soup wasn't about flavor fireworks. It was about stretching one egg, 1 cup of broth, and a handful of scraps into something that tasted just enough like hope. Boiled dinner, corned beef, cabbage, and potatoes. It didn't look like much, but boiled dinner was the backbone of factory towns and farmhouse kitchens alike. You started with a slab of corned beef, salty, brined, and tough as shoe leather until you showed it patience. Tossed into a big pot of water, it simmered for hours, softening slow while the house filled with a rich, peppery steam. Whole potatoes came next, skins on and scrubbed clean, dropped into the broth like stones. Carrots, thick cut, and cabbage stacked in big leafy layers joined after, soaking up the meaty, salty flavor until every bite tasted like it belonged to a different century. It wasn't delicate, it wasn't fast, but it fed everybody from the youngest kid to the oldest granddad, stretching across meals and into sandwiches and hash the next morning. Some slathered their corned beef in mustard, others just loaded their plates high and ate until they couldn't move. Boiled dinner wasn't about looking good. It was about surviving another cold night with something warm in your belly and enough left over to hope tomorrow might feel a little easier. Tomato sandwiches with salt and pepper. When the gardens came in, heavy, and the pantry stayed light, tomato sandwiches were the food of kings. Thick slices of fresh tomato, red and dripping, laid out on 2 slices of soft white bread, slicked with a smear of mayonnaise if you had it, and if you didn't, plain was good enough. A heavy sprinkle of salt, a crack of black pepper, and that was it. Fold the bread together, bite down, and let the juice run down your wrists while you leaned over the sink, catching every messy drop. No sides, no fancy spreads, just bread, tomatoes, and the wild, bursting flavor of something you grew yourself, or traded for, or begged off a neighbor's vines. In the hottest days of the year, when the stove was too much trouble and the air was too heavy to think, a tomato sandwich wasn't just a meal. It was a reminder that simple things could still taste like luxury, even when the wallet said otherwise. Dandelion greens with vinegar and bacon. You didn't buy these greens at a store. You picked them from the cracks in the sidewalk and the edges of fields, stubborn little leaves that grew no matter how mean the weather got. Dandelion greens were wild, bitter, and free, and they turned into dinner with just a little bacon and a hot skillet. First, you fried up a few scraps of bacon, fatty ends and pieces, not pretty strips, until the grease ran thick. Then, the cleaned dandelion greens went in, wilting fast, the bitterness taming just enough in the smoky, salty fat. A splash of vinegar right at the end woke the whole dish up, cutting through the grease and bringing every mouthful to life. It was sharp, savory, and honest. The kind of plate that snapped your senses awake and reminded you what survival really tasted like. Dandelion greens with vinegar and bacon wasn't about getting by. It was about fighting back, about taking what the world threw away and making it better than it had any right to be. City chicken, mock chicken legs. It looked like a drumstick. It crunched like a drumstick, but there wasn't a lick of chicken in it. In butcher shops where poultry was a luxury and pork was cheap, city chicken, mock chicken legs, was a working man's trick to turn scarcity into something special. Cubes of pork or veal were skewered tightly onto sticks, dipped in beaten egg, rolled in breadcrumbs, and pan-fried or baked until golden and crisp. When they hit the skillet, they sizzled like the real thing. When they came out, steaming and tender under that crispy shell, nobody cared what meat was hiding inside. Some folks finished them off in the oven, wrapped in foil to keep the juices locked in. Others just fried them until the breadcrumbs turned a deep, toasted brown. Kids loved them. Grown-ups depended on them, and everyone knew the truth. It wasn't about what it was. It was about what it tasted like, served alongside mashed potatoes, a scoop of gravy, or just eaten straight off the stick with your fingers. City chicken turned a handful of scraps into something that felt like a feast. Bologna boats with melted cheese. Nobody pretended this was fancy. Bologna boats were what you made when the fridge was almost empty. The paycheck was late, and you still had hungry mouths to feed. Thick slices of bologna, laid out on a battered baking sheet, curled up at the edges as the oven heat hit them, forming little bowls just begging to be filled. Into the middle went shredded cheese, whatever was on hand, cheddar, mozzarella, or even broken slices of American cheese. Some folks added a pinch of crushed saltines on top for a little crunch. Others left it simple and greasy. They baked until the bologna crisped at the edges and the cheese bubbled into little golden puddles. Pulling them out of the oven, the smell was pure childhood, a mix of salt, fat, and something that felt almost, but not quite, like indulgence. Served with canned green beans, a spoonful of coleslaw, or just grabbed 3 at a time straight off the pan, bologna boats were comfort food in its purest, scrappiest form. Nobody at the table cared about presentation. They just cared that dinner was hot, salty, and enough to fill them up. Spam and rice skillet. When meat prices spiked and grocery shelves started to thin, Spam was the hero nobody expected. Spam and rice skillet was a Depression-born classic that never apologized for being what it was: salty, fatty, and just enough to fill a plate when little else could. You cubed up a can of Spam into rough chunks, browned them in a screaming hot skillet until the edges got crisp and caramelized, then tossed in a mound of cooked white rice. Some folks added frozen peas or a few shreds of cabbage if they had them, but most nights it was just meat, rice, and maybe a splash of soy sauce or black pepper. The fat from the Spam slicked every grain of rice in flavor, turning what should have been bland into something smoky and rich. It was fast, heavy, and comforting in a way you didn't question. Spam and rice skillet wasn't about health or presentation. It was about survival, about making a single can stretch across dinner and tomorrow's lunch. It wasn't supposed to be pretty. It was supposed to keep you standing, and it did. Baked bean sandwiches. You didn't need a steak when you had baked bean sandwiches, just a can of beans, a loaf of soft white bread, and the stubborn kind of hunger that made anything taste good. The beans, sweet, smoky, and sticky, got warmed in a pot if you had the time, straight from the can if you didn't. You spooned a thick heap onto a slice of bread, let the sauce soak into the soft crumb, and capped it with another slice before everything slid apart. It wasn't neat, it wasn't fancy. Half the time, the sandwich collapsed before you got your second bite, but nobody cared. Hands and faces got messy. Plates caught drips and spills. The kitchen smelled like molasses and brown sugar, and if you closed your eyes, you could almost pretend you were eating something decadent. Baked bean sandwiches were about more than just calories. They were about making do, finding a little sweetness when the world didn't offer much, and laughing around a table held together more by hope than by wood. Factory town boiled dinner. Variation. with beans and salt meat. This wasn't just dinner, it was an entire week packed into a single pot. Factory Town boiled dinner was the working man's answer to not knowing if next week's pay was coming. It started with the toughest cuts of salt-cured meat, brisket if you were lucky, pork scraps if you weren't, tossed into the biggest pot you owned and covered in water. Potatoes came next, whole and unpeeled, soaking up all that briny broth. Then came the beans, tossed in dry if you had time, canned if you didn't. Carrots, onions, and thick wedges of cabbage layered on top until the pot looked like it could barely hold it all. It simmered for hours, the smell filling every crack in the house. A sharp, peppery steam that meant dinner was almost ready, even if you had to ladle it out one careful scoop at a time. Some families slathered the salt meat with mustard. Others just let the broth do the talking. Boiled dinner wasn't about flavor fireworks. It was about feeding tired bodies without wasting a single scrap. And when it stretched into lunches and sandwiches later in the week, nobody complained. It was survival, seasoned with patience. Breaded veal cutlets with instant mashed potatoes. For a few minutes, you could almost pretend it was payday. Breaded veal cutlets were thin, quick, and just fancy enough to feel like you were celebrating something, even if you weren't. Thin slices of veal, pounded even flatter with the bottom of a jar or a rolling pin, were dipped in flour, then egg, then a heavy coat of breadcrumbs. They hit the skillet and sizzled immediately, the breading locking in the tiny bit of moisture the cutlet had left. In a few minutes, they crisped up golden and hot, with a crunch that sounded like breaking into something better than you could afford. Beside them, a scoop of instant mashed potatoes, stirred together with butter and hot water until they faked their way onto the plate like the real thing. A ladle of brown gravy if you had it, just a pat of butter if you didn't. The whole meal came together in 20 minutes flat, with just enough pomp to make a Tuesday night feel a little less desperate. Breaded veal cutlets weren't about luxury, they were about hope, fried golden, and served hot. Salt pork and beans. It was simple, salty, and good enough to keep a man going through the longest days. Salt pork and beans weren't about impressing anybody. They were about calories, comfort, and using what the world hadn't taken yet. Thick slabs of salt pork, heavily cured to survive months without refrigeration, were tossed into a heavy pot and boiled until they surrendered their briny richness. Dried beans, white, navy, or pinto, whatever was cheapest, followed right after, soaking up all that smoky saltiness. Sometimes a bay leaf was thrown in for good luck. Sometimes just a cracked black peppercorn. The whole pot simmered low and steady for hours, the smell clinging to the walls, the curtains, your clothes. When it was finally ready, the beans were tender, the pork was falling apart, and the broth was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. It wasn't delicate, it wasn't refined. It was food that respected the hard work it took to bring it to the table. Salt pork and beans filled stomachs, quieted complaints, and reminded people that survival sometimes tasted like salt, fat, and a whole lot of stubbornness. Smothered pork chops with onion gravy. If there was ever a dinner that could make you forget how tight the week had been, it was smothered pork chops drowning in onion gravy. Thick bone-in chops hit the skillet with a hard sear, crisping up the fat and filling the kitchen with the kind of smell that pulled everyone to the table before you even called. Once the meat was browned and set aside, you built the real star of the show, the gravy. A spoonful of flour straight into the drippings, stirred until every last scrap lifted off the pan. Then came the sliced onions, cooked down until they were soft, golden, and almost sweet. A splash of broth loosened it all into a thick, silky sauce that smelled better than payday. The chops went back in, covered and left to simmer low until they were fork tender and soaked with flavor. Served over white bread, mashed potatoes, or just straight from the pan, every bite was salty, rich, and dripping with memories. Smothered pork chops weren't about showing off. They were about showing up with everything you had. Hot dog and potato hash. It wasn't glamorous, but when the fridge was bare and payday was a week away, hot dog and potato hash was the answer. You took whatever hot dogs you could scrounge up, cheap, rubbery, bright red if you were unlucky, and chopped them into coins. Potatoes were diced rough, skins on, and fried hard in a hot skillet until the edges turned crisp and golden. Onions were tossed in if you had them, sizzling down into sweet browned bits between the potatoes. Then came the hot dogs, tossed into the pan and fried until they split and curled at the edges. Some folks stirred in a little ketchup or mustard right in the pan, turning the whole mess into something tangy and bright. Others just threw it onto plates as is and called it good. It was salty, greasy, filling, and honest. It didn't pretend to be anything more than it was. Scraps turned into supper, thrown together fast, but hitting the stomach like a brick. Hot dog and potato hash was proof that you didn't need much to make something hot, hearty, and just good enough to get you to the next day. Fried cabbage with bacon drippings? It didn't take much to turn a head of cabbage into something that could fill the whole house. You started with a heavy iron skillet, slicked with bacon drippings, saved from better mornings. When the pan got hot enough to smoke, you threw in rough-chopped cabbage by the handful, the green leaves hissing and wilting down into the fat. A little salt, a crack of black pepper. That was all it needed. Some folks tossed in diced onions if they had them, or a few crumbles of leftover bacon if the pantry was generous. But even bare, just cabbage and fat, it fried up into something sweet, smoky, and good enough to make you forget what wasn't sitting on the table next to it. Piled high on a plate with nothing but a piece of white bread to chase it down, fried cabbage wasn't just a side dish. It was survival food. It stretched the budget, filled the kitchen with the smell of something real, and gave everyone around the table one more reason to believe tomorrow would come with a little more on their plate. Ground beef and corn casserole. It wasn't pretty, but it was the kind of meal that filled a kitchen with the smell of something good, something solid. You browned a pound of ground beef in a big skillet, no draining, no measuring, just enough to get the fat sizzling. Then you tossed in a can of corn, a scoop of tomato paste or whatever sauce you had lying around, and a few shakes of chili powder for good measure. The whole mess got dumped into a battered baking dish. Then came the topping, crushed saltines, cornbread batter, or even a quick pancake mix if that's all you had. It baked into a golden, crackly blanket that hid the rich, smoky beef underneath. This wasn't some polished casserole with a dozen fancy ingredients. It was sweet, salty, filling, and cheap enough to feed a family on nickels. If there were leftovers, they only got better overnight, soaking up all the flavors into something even heavier. Ground beef and corn casserole didn't try to impress anybody. It just got the job done, fast and without apology, at the end of a day when nobody had anything left to give but hunger. Buttered noodles with cracked black pepper. Sometimes the best meals came from the bottom of the pantry and the last stick of butter. Buttered noodles with cracked black pepper were pure, simple magic for nights when dinner needed to happen fast and cheap. You boiled egg noodles or spaghetti, whatever you could find, until just tender, drained them, and dropped in a fat slab of butter while the steam was still rising. tossed and tumbled in the pot, the noodles turned glossy and rich, soaking up every drop. Then came the black pepper, cracked fresh if you had it, shaken from a battered tin if you didn't, scattered over the noodles like confetti. Some folks threw in a pinch of salt, maybe a dusting of cheese if they were lucky, but most just let the butter and pepper do the talking. It wasn't hearty, it wasn't heavy, but it was warm, filling, and good enough to make a long day feel a little softer. Buttered noodles didn't try to impress anyone. They just made sure you got from one day to the next, one bowl at a time. Slow-cooked beef heart stew. It wasn't the cut anyone wanted, but in lean times, beef heart was a gift. Lean, dense, and packed with flavor. If you knew what you were doing, it needed careful hands and a lot of patience. You trimmed it slow, slicing away anything tough or stringy, then browned it hard in a heavy pot until the whole kitchen smelled like something real. Broth or water came next, enough to just cover, maybe with a splash of vinegar or a couple bay leaves to help tenderize the stubborn muscle. Low heat and long hours were the secret. Left to simmer all day, the heart softened, giving up its toughness and taking on a richness that didn't taste like anything else. Carrots and parsnips went in near the end, adding sweetness and body to the stew. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't supposed to be. It was survival food, nourishment pulled out of the parts most people threw away. Served with bread, rice, or just eaten straight from the pot, slow-cooked beef heart stew reminded everyone at the table that tough times could still produce tender meals, if you were willing to work for it. Potato soup with saltine crackers. It didn't get much simpler or more stubborn than potato soup. You peeled and chopped potatoes rough, boiled them with a little salt until they softened, then mashed them half-heartedly right there in the broth. A splash of milk if you had it, a pat of butter if you could spare it. Otherwise, just water and starch and the quiet satisfaction of knowing there'd be something hot in every bowl. Saltines sat in a chipped tin on the counter. You crushed them over the soup, letting them melt into the broth, thickening it just enough to feel heavy on the spoon. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't even fancy enough to pretend. But it filled your belly, warmed your hands, and reminded you that even when the cupboards were thin, dinner still showed up if you worked for it. Rice pudding dinner, sweet and filling. When there wasn't enough meat and the pantry shelves were running thin, sweet dinners like rice pudding pulled their weight. You boiled up a pot of white rice, thick and soft, then stirred in a little milk, a handful of sugar, and whatever scraps of spices you had. Cinnamon, if you were lucky, nutmeg if you were blessed. Some folks cracked an egg into the pot to make it richer. Others just let the milk and sugar thicken into a loose, sweet slurry that clung to every grain. Raisins made it in if you had them, but most nights it was just rice, milk, and hope. Spoon it hot into deep bowls, steaming and fragrant, and you had something that filled you up fast, even if it wasn't what you really wanted. It was warm, it was heavy, and it stayed with you through the night. Rice pudding for dinner wasn't about treats. It was about calories, comfort, and making a handful of cheap staples taste like something that could carry you through the next day. Sweet, simple, and stubborn. That was the secret. Turnip green stew with ham fat. It wasn't the meat you tasted first. It was the greens, sharp and earthy, heavy with the smoky promise of ham fat. Turnip green stew wasn't a fancy dinner. It was what you made when the ham was long gone, but the bones and the grease still had something left to give. You boiled down big handfuls of fresh or canned turnip greens until they turned tender and deep green, soaking up every last drop of broth made from ham bones or a heavy spoonful of saved bacon drippings. A little onion went in if you had it, maybe a dash of vinegar at the end to cut the richness. Served hot in deep bowls, maybe with a slab of cornbread crumbling into the broth. It didn't look like much, but it filled you up, warmed you through, and left you feeling heavier and stronger than when you sat down. Turnip green stew wasn't just about eating. It was about not letting anything go to waste. Not a bone, not a drop of grease, not a single green leaf that could be pulled from a stubborn patch of ground. Lazy man's cabbage roll, casserole. Rolling individual cabbage leaves took time nobody had, so folks came up with a smarter way. Lazy man's cabbage roll, casserole. It had all the same smoky, sweet, hearty flavors of the old country dish, without any of the fiddly work. You browned ground beef in a big skillet with chopped onions and garlic, maybe a sprinkle of salt and pepper if you had it. Then you stirred in cooked rice and layers of chopped cabbage, pouring a good amount of tomato sauce over everything until it looked more like a mess than a meal. But in the oven, it transformed. The tomato sauce soaked into the rice, the beef melted into the cabbage, and the whole dish baked into a bubbling, fork-tender reminder that sometimes shortcuts are just plain smart. It came out steamy and hearty, smelling like Sunday dinner even when it was slapped together on a Wednesday night. Some folks added a splash of vinegar for tang, or a dollop of sour cream on top if payday had been good. Lazy man's cabbage roll casserole wasn't about cutting corners. It was about keeping dinner alive without losing your mind. Liver and onions with fried potatoes. The smell hit you first, sharp, rich, and heavy, in a way that filled the whole house and clung to your clothes. Liver and onions wasn't for everyone, but for those who grew up with it, it meant one thing: a real meal was coming. Thin slices of beef liver were dredged in flour and seared in a hot skillet until just browned on the outside, but still tender in the middle. Meanwhile, onions fried alongside, turning soft, sweet, and golden as they picked up every bit of flavor left in the pan. Fried potatoes, chunked rough and crisped in the same fat, rounded out the plate, soaking up the juices and giving every bite some weight. Salt and pepper were about the only seasonings you needed. Maybe a splash of vinegar if you were feeling fancy. It wasn't a meal you made for show. It was bold, unapologetic, and packed with enough iron and heft to keep a man working from sunup to sundown. Liver and onions with fried potatoes was proof that sometimes the toughest cuts of meat made the most unforgettable meals. Rice and tomato gravy. When the cupboards were almost bare but you still needed something hot and filling, rice and tomato gravy was the answer. It started simple: white rice boiled soft and piled high in big battered bowls. The gravy came next. Cheap canned tomatoes, juice and all, simmered with a little water, a spoonful of bacon grease if you had it, and a heavy hand of salt and pepper. Sometimes there was a pinch of sugar to take the edge off the acid. Sometimes just a prayer. You ladled the tomato gravy straight over the mound of steaming rice, letting the bright red sauce soak into every grain. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even pretty. But it was hot, it was heavy, and it stayed with you. Rice and tomato gravy didn't try to pretend. It was about using what you had and stretching it until it gave up everything it could. In kitchens, where a can of tomatoes and a handful of rice could mean the difference between dinner and going without, this was the kind of meal that made sure nobody left the table empty. Oxtail stew with barley and carrots. It wasn't the kind of meat you bragged about, but in homes that knew how to make something out of nothing, oxtail was king. You started by browning the tough, bony pieces in a heavy pot until the kitchen filled with a deep, savory smell that meant dinner was happening. Onions, Garlic and rough-chopped carrots went in next, picking up all the brown bits left behind. A scoop of barley followed, heavy and reliable, and then enough broth to cover the whole mess. Then you waited. Hours, usually. Long enough for the oxtail to soften into tender, rich ribbons of meat. Long enough for the barley to thicken the broth into something closer to a meal than a soup. Some folks threw in a bay leaf or a splash of vinegar. Most just let it simmer and trusted the heat to work its magic. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't fast, but when you ladled that stew into a chipped bowl and tore off a hunk of bread to chase it down, it was everything. It fed you, it warmed you, and it made sure nothing, not even the scraps, went to waste. Blood gravy over biscuits. It sounds brutal, and it was. But back when nothing could be wasted, blood gravy was the kind of dinner that kept people standing. Fresh blood from pigs or cows was whisked into a hot skillet with a little flour, a splash of milk if there was any to spare, and a heavy hand of black pepper. It thickened quick into a dark, rich sauce that smelled stronger than anything you had ever tasted. Served ladled over biscuits, homemade if there was time, store-bought if there wasn't, blood gravy turned the scraps of the kitchen into a full, heavy meal. It wasn't fancy, and it sure wasn't delicate. It was iron-rich, packed with body, and it stuck to your ribs like it meant it. For folks living paycheck to paycheck, or not even that, it was a miracle in a pan. Some families seasoned it with sage or onion. Others kept it bare bones and let the richness speak for itself. It wasn't for picky eaters, but it filled the house with the smell of survival. Blood gravy didn't pretend to be pretty. It just did its job, and sometimes that's all a dinner needed to do. Salisbury steak with mushroom gravy. It was the closest thing most families got to steak, and nobody minded one bit. Salisbury steak started with ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, salt, pepper, and maybe a splash of Worcestershire, if someone had splurged a little. You shaped the mix into thick oval patties, seared them hard in a skillet until the edges crusted and the inside stayed juicy. Then you set them aside and built the real magic. Mushroom gravy. A handful of sliced mushrooms and a chopped onion sizzled in the fat left behind. A quick dusting of flour, a slow pour of broth, and suddenly the skillet was bubbling with a rich, savory sauce that smelled like it cost a whole lot more than it did. The patties went back into the pan, soaking up every drop of flavor while the gravy thickened. Spoon it over a scoop of mashed potatoes, boxed or scratch, it didn't matter, and you had yourself a meal that made a Tuesday night feel almost like Sunday. Salisbury steak wasn't about luxury. It was about tricking the world into thinking you had a little more than you did, and pulling it off so well nobody questioned it. Fried cornmeal. Mush with gravy. Cornmeal mush wasn't just breakfast. It was survival on a plate. You boiled cornmeal in water until it thickened into a stiff, heavy mass that stuck to the sides of the pot like concrete. Once it cooled, it was sliced into thick, golden bricks and fried in a skillet until the edges turned crisp and brown, the inside staying soft and warm. But fried cornmeal mush by itself wasn't always enough. That's where the gravy came in. Thin white gravy made from a little bacon fat, a spoonful of flour, and just enough milk or water to stretch it. Poured hot over the crisp slices, it turned plain mush into a full meal, heavy enough to get you through a long day in the fields or the factory. Some folks added black pepper until it looked like the surface of the moon. Others kept it plain and simple because that's all they had. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even that pretty. But it was food that filled your belly and stayed there, stubborn and steady, long after the plate was empty. Cornmeal mush with gravy wasn't about flavor fireworks. It was about making something lasting from almost nothing. Cold meatloaf sandwiches. The second day was always the best. Cold meatloaf sandwiches weren't an afterthought. They were the whole reason you made a double-sized loaf in the first place. Yesterday's meatloaf pulled cold from the fridge, sliced thick enough to hold together without crumbling, slapped between two slices of soft white bread. A heavy squirt of yellow mustard cut through the richness, sharp and bright against the dense, seasoned meat. Some folks swore by adding a pickle spear or a slice of raw onion. Others kept it simple, just bread, meat, and a memory of last night's dinner. No heating, no pan, no fuss. Just grab it, wrap it in wax paper if you were fancy, and head out the door. It was the lunch of factory workers, mechanics, and anyone who didn't have time to waste standing over a stove. The fat in the loaf firmed up overnight. The seasoning settled deeper, and somehow the sandwich always tasted even better than the hot meal ever did. Cold meatloaf sandwiches were proof that sometimes the leftovers were the real prize, and that the best meals didn't always come out of a hot oven. Pickled pig's feet with boiled potatoes. You either loved them or you didn't, but pickled pig's feet were a rite of passage in kitchens that couldn't afford to waste a thing. It started with a clear glass jar packed tight with pig's feet soaked in vinegar, garlic, and a handful of rough spices. They sat there for days, sometimes weeks, until the meat turned soft, tangy, and gelatinous. Once pulled out, the feet weren't dressed up. They were slapped onto a plate beside a scoop of plain boiled potatoes, steaming and humble. You didn't eat pickled pig's feet because you wanted fine dining. You ate them because they filled you up, gave you collagen and protein when money couldn't. The vinegar cut through the richness, and the potatoes smoothed it out, balancing salty, sour, and starchy into something weirdly comforting. No one pretended this was elegant food. It was daring, gritty, unapologetically real. It didn't just feed you, it dared you to be tougher than your circumstances. In homes where pride meant nothing if your stomach was empty, pickled pig's feet were a badge of honor. Rice and red beans. It was slow food by necessity, not design. Red beans and rice started in the morning, with a pot of dry beans soaking up water and hope while the world spun outside the window. Later, you boiled them low and steady, maybe with a scrap of ham bone or a spoonful of bacon grease, until the beans turned creamy and the pot turned heavy with the smell of something rich and right. Meanwhile, a pot of plain white rice sat waiting on the back burner, ready to catch every scoop of the thick, smoky stew. Salt, pepper, and whatever seasoning you could scrap together filled the gaps. Sometimes a little hot sauce for those who needed more fire. Rice and red beans didn't need sides. They didn't need decoration. They just needed a bowl and a spoon and someone who understood that filling your stomach mattered more than fancy presentation. In homes where Sunday stretched into Monday, and there wasn't always enough to go around, red beans and rice made sure there was still something hot and ready on the stove. Mashed potato pancakes. It started with the leftovers, the lumpy, cold mashed potatoes nobody wanted to reheat. You mixed in a little flour, maybe an egg if you could spare one, and shaped the stiff, sticky dough into rough patties with flour-caked hands. Into a hot, greased skillet they went, sizzling and sputtering as the outsides crisped to a deep golden brown, while the insides stayed soft, almost creamy. You didn't need anything else. Maybe a little salt and pepper on top. Maybe a scrap of sour cream if there was a lonely tub in the icebox. Most days it was just the pancakes themselves, stacked high on a chipped plate, steaming, salty, and ready to fill the hollow spot left by a long, hard day. Mashed potato pancakes were proof that a second-hand meal could still taste better than anything new. They were born from necessity, from stubbornness, from the refusal to waste even a spoonful of yesterday's dinner. And sometimes they tasted better than anything that had come fresh off the stove. Hungarian chicken paprikash. It started with a smell, deep, smoky, and sweet, floating out from a heavy pot on the stove. Hungarian chicken paprikash didn't require a lot, just bone-in chicken, a few onions, a heavy hand with the paprika, and time. You browned the chicken first, letting the fat crisp up and render down. Then you threw in the onions, slicing them thin and frying them until golden and collapsing. Right when the house smelled rich enough to eat, you dumped in a full scoop of paprika, not a sprinkle, but a whole handful, turning everything a deep, earthy red. A little flour thickened the sauce. A splash of broth loosened it again. And just before serving, a spoonful of sour cream stirred through gave it a velvety richness that tasted like a secret too good to share. It poured thick and heavy over wide egg noodles, every bite smoky, savory, and tinged with just a little tang. Hungarian chicken paprikash didn't care if you had much money. It only cared if you had the will to make something unforgettable out of almost nothing. It was the kind of dinner you remembered long after the plates were clean.